There are also very theistic forms of Dvaita philosophy and many bhakti movements, which are movements that are based on devotion to a particular deity. There is a pretty strong dualistic emphasis, because in order to have a relationship with another being, there has to be some sense of separation between oneself and the other being. And there are, especially within Vaishnava traditions, which are Hindu traditions which revere Vishnu, there are a lot of sects where the goal is conceptualized as going to Vaikuntha after death, which is like heaven. It's Vishnu's realm. So those forms of Dvaita philosophy are very similar in some ways to Abrahamic religions and other forms of theistic devotional religion. The second philosophical framework that we're going to be discussing today has several different names, but basically it is unity in duality. So it's a middle point between pure dualism and pure non-dualism. There are several different schools that fall within this category, including Vishishtadvaita, which means qualified non-dualism, Bheda, which means different, non-different, Dvaita, which means dual, non-dual, and Achintya Bheda, which means inconceivable difference and non-difference. One metaphor that is very common among these different school of thoughts is that the supreme divinity is like the sun, and the individual souls are like the rays of the sun. So they have the same essence, but they're different quantitatively. Qualitatively, they're made of the same stuff. Quantitatively, the sun itself is far grander than any individual soul. One thinker who followed this line of thought was named Vijnana Bhikshu, who reinterpreted Patanjali and saw Purushas, the individual souls, as creations of Ishvara, the divine being talked about in Patanjali's system. And for Vijnana Bhikshu, Viveka, this discernment, was still important, but he placed a little bit more emphasis on bhakti and devotion to Ishvara than Patanjali did. There's also a very well-known school of practice and devotion called Gaudiya Vaishnavism, which is the Bengali school of Vaishnavism, and which gave birth to the Hare Krishna movement, which follows Achintya Bheda, which means that they believe that the exact nature of the relationship between the individual soul and the supreme soul, who they saw as this deity named Krishna, is inconceivable and can only be fully grokked within certain ecstatic states of consciousness. The third philosophical position that we're going to be talking about today is Advaita, or non-dualism. And the most famous proponent of non-dualism was Adi Shankara, who lived from around 788 to 820 CE, and who systematized Advaita thought within a school that is known as Advaita Vedanta, and is one of the most popular and influential schools of Hindu thought and practice. And oftentimes, people who are talking about Hinduism have only heard about Advaita Vedanta and confuse Advaita Vedanta for the whole of Hinduism, basically. The most influential thinker in the Advaita system is known as Adi Shankara, who lived from around 788 to 820 CE. Adi Shankara systematized Advaita Vedanta, which is one of the most influential forms of Hindu philosophy in the world. Advaita Vedanta really built on the yogic system that Patanjali set out, but then re-evaluated the dualistic philosophy and drew on other sources and ideas in order to reinterpret consciousness not as a primarily individual phenomenon like the Purusha as an individual soul, but rather as a universal substratum of all of reality. Within Advaita Vedanta, there is a lot of talk about different forms of Brahman, the supreme reality, or different aspects, where the highest aspect, according to Advaita Vedanta, is called Nirguna Brahman, which is Brahman or reality without attributes. So it is an impersonal, unchanging, formless, ultimate supreme reality. There are also lesser forms, according to Advaita, which are Saguna. So Saguna Brahman is reality with attributes. So that means that all of the symbolic qualities that are associated with Hindu deities, like having different arms or having a particular energetic signature in their mantra and so on, all of these symbolic representations of supreme reality are given particular attributes to help us to relate to that particular form of divinity. But according to the Advaita system, ultimately, they are limited representations of the supreme reality, which is formless. There are interesting arguments within different forms of Hinduism where the Advaita Vedanta people really emphasize Nirguna Brahman, and then there are Krishna Bhakti people who really emphasize Saguna Brahman and actually say that Krishna has unlimited attributes, and one of those attributes includes the ability to appear as having no attributes in a lesser manifestation. So there's this argument between these different schools of thought regarding whether Nirguna Brahman or Saguna Brahman is supreme, but for our purposes, you can relate to divinity either as impersonal and formless or as a personal divinity, and either is perfectly legitimate. Within Advaita Vedanta, there are certain philosophical terms and ideas which have really spread throughout the yoga world that you may be familiar with, such as Maya, which is a word that often gets translated as illusion. And within Advaita Vedanta, it does literally mean illusion. So according to the Advaita Vedanta philosophy, the manifest universe, which is characterized by this sense of being a separate individual being, and with all these diverse forms and elements, that world is actually illusory. It does not exist. It's like a mirage, and there is this cycle of getting trapped in the illusion due to karma that can only be escaped from through jnana, which is liberating self-knowledge. This word jnana is cognate to the Greek word gnosis, which is a word which literally refers to knowledge of the divine. So there's jnana yoga, which we'll be talking about in a later video. And jnana yoga in some ways drew heavily on Patanjali's form of meditative yoga, but then also added different elements. But there's a similar kind of emphasis on cultivating viveka or discernment, and this very introversive, contemplative system of drawing one's awareness inward so that we're not aware of external objects or of our thoughts and feelings, but rather we are becoming aware of awareness itself. The fourth school of thought that we will be discussing today is called Param Advaita, which means supreme non-dualism. I tend to actually translate this non-literally as dialectical monism, which is a term that also gets applied to other schools of thought such as Taoism. Param Advaita is a system in which there is one supreme reality that chooses to contract a portion of its energy to create the appearance of differentiation within itself. So that means that there are all these dualities that exist within nature, like hot and cold, light and dark, self and other, pain and pleasure, etc., which are ontologically real insofar as the divine oneness has created these differences within itself, and they are real differences, but at the same time, the essence of reality remains one and undivided. Within non-dual Shakta Shaiva Tantra, this concept of Maya gets redefined, where it's no longer regarded as an illusion. This world is ontologically real. It has actual existence as a manifestation of universal oneness. So Maya in non-dual Shakta Shaiva Tantra is redefined as something like the power of universal consciousness to create the appearance of separation within itself. There are different forms of spiritual practice that can be found within the Param-Advaita view. There is often a heavy emphasis on jnana, on this Gnostic realization of the innate divinity within oneself through meditative contemplation and discernment and things of that nature. And within the Krama lineage of Shakta Shaiva Tantra, as well as within the Kaula Trika lineage, there's something called the Krama Mudra, which means the seal of the divine process, basically, which is a system in which there is a cyclical death and rebirth, basically, through drawing one's awareness inward so far or to such a degree that awareness becomes aware of itself, and the limited individual identity dissolves into universal consciousness. But then, in the Krama Mudra, rather than that being the final state of being, the final state of liberation, as it is in, for example, the Advaita Vedanta system, that is a stage in a cyclical process of death and rebirth, where after this spiritual dissolution and death of the ego, the individual identity is then reborn in an awakened form. So there's this process of going inward and dissolving, and then of going outward and being reborn. And when the second part of that process takes place, it is a state of awakened rebirth where there's this direct insight into the nature of manifest reality, of the universe, as being fundamentally inseparable from universal consciousness. And in fact, universal consciousness is always present in each and every moment, here and now, and can be realized at any moment. However, it is only through this process of spiritual death and rebirth that people are generally able to directly, experientially know the wholeness of reality while still alive. In addition, there are also forms of non-dual bhakti within Shakta Shaiva Tantra and other forms of Param-Advaita, where somebody can be devoted to a particular deity, but there's an understanding that that deity is just a symbolic representation of the divine consciousness that exists within themselves already. So there are these practices that involve deity yoga, or identifying with a particular deity, divinizing oneself, one's body, and one's mind as a vessel for that deity, and then also doing these devotional practices, these external forms of ritual or singing or chanting or what have you, that express love for that divine consciousness that exists within oneself and in all of reality.